The iron gate of the Caldwell mansion closed behind Robert Caldwell with a cold echo, like a sentence being handed down. Just that morning, this place had still been his home. The white stone steps, the perfectly trimmed rows of trees, the garage once filled with luxury cars, and the living room where his wife used to smile for the cameras during charity events. But by afternoon, everything had become property seized by the bank. Robert stood in the late autumn wind, his expensive suit wrinkled after a long day in court, a small suitcase at his feet, with only a dying phone in his pocket and a few legal papers his attorney had not yet had time to explain clearly. Eleanor Caldwell sat in the black Mercedes, a few steps away. Her face still beautiful, still elegant, but her eyes no longer held even a trace of warmth. She removed her wedding ring, placed it on the passenger seat as if setting down something that no longer had any value, then said through the half-open window, "I spent 20 years living beside an empire. I don't know how to live beside the ashes of it." Robert looked at her, not begging, not angry, only silent, as if his heart was too exhausted to break one more time. When the car rolled away, he began calling every name in his contact list. Old friends, former partners, his attorney, people who had once called him brother. No one answered. 15 years earlier, Robert Caldwell was still a name that appeared on the covers of business magazines. The man the financial world called a symbol of cold, precise success. That night, he left St. Matthew Hospital after a charity fundraiser. His black suit without a single wrinkle, his driver already holding the car door open, while the doctors still stood behind him, thanking him for the large donation to the children's treatment wing. But when Robert stepped down the last stair, the smell of hot soup and lightly spicy fried chicken pulled his eyes across the street. Under a small awning bent at the edges by the rain, a young black woman was standing beside an old food cart, her hands moving quickly as she packed meal after meal for the night shift nurses. Her name was Tamika Johnson. She wore a thin jacket, her hair tied neatly behind her neck, her face tired, but her eyes still holding a stubborn kind of dignity. As Robert was about to step into the car, a city worker stopped in front of her stand, holding a stack of citation papers and saying her permit had expired. Tamika went still. In her small wallet, the money set aside for the permit was also the money for her son's medicine. Tamika stood in front of her food cart, gripping the edge of her apron as if the moment she let go, her whole life would fall along with that citation. The city worker said in a tired voice that rules were rules, and if she did not pay the fee and renew her permit by tomorrow morning, the cart would be towed away. Robert looked at the still warm meal boxes on the counter, then at the small photo of a boy taped inside the cart door, and asked who the boy was. Tamika was silent for a moment before saying he was Isaiah, her son, 8 years old, waiting for a heart treatment that insurance would not fully cover. Robert took out his wallet, but Tamika immediately stepped back. She did not want pity. She said she only needed a fair chance to work. That sentence made Robert put the money away. He bought all the food she had left, asked his driver to take it into the hospital for the night shift nurses, then called someone at the small business support fund he had once sponsored. Before leaving, he only left behind a business card and said very softly that if one day she found her footing, she should help someone else who was hungry. 15 years after that rainy night, Robert Caldwell sat alone on a stone bench outside the bus station, where people who had once worked in his buildings walked past without daring to look at him for long. The phone in his hand kept lighting up, not because anyone was calling him back, but because new headlines kept appearing like small knives. The Caldwell empire collapses. Real estate billionaire under investigation. Investors wiped out after financial scandal. His name, his face, his entire life had been reduced to cold headlines that no one bothered to ask the truth behind. The black card that had once opened every door for him had been declined at a hotel desk less than an hour earlier, and his attorney had warned him not to touch any account until the freeze order was lifted. Robert knew the company had shown signs of trouble months earlier. The numbers that Chief Financial Officer David Mercer presented were always too clean, too perfect. But by the time he demanded an independent audit, it was already too late. His accounts were frozen, his attorney advised him to stay silent, and Eleanor was the fastest one to leave, as if she had been prepared for this day all along. Robert looked down at the leather shoes that had once been polished every morning by the house staff. Now they were stained with street dust and rainwater. For the first time in many years, he did not know where he would sleep tonight. Night fell very slowly, as if the city was deliberately stretching out Robert Caldwell's loneliness. The streetlights cast a pale yellow glow over the wet sidewalk, while he sat motionless on the stone bench, the small suitcase at his feet like the last piece of luggage from a life that had collapsed. His stomach was hungry, but the shame was larger than the hunger. He had once walked into restaurants where people stood up to shake his hand before he even had time to sit down. And yet now, even a hot bowl of soup had become something he did not dare to hope for, just as Robert was about to stand and look for some awning to shelter under. For the night, the white lights of a food truck slowly pulled up to the curb. On the side of the truck were the words Grace and Grit Kitchen, painted in a simple but warm, deep blue. The truck door opened, and a middle-aged black woman stepped down, holding a box of food still steaming in her hand. She looked at him for a long time, not with pity, not with surprise, only as if she were seeing an old promise finally finding its way back. Robert quietly said he had no money. The woman smiled, her eyes, once tired in the rain 15 years earlier, now calm and bright. "You already paid, Mr. Caldwell. 15 years ago." Robert looked closely at that face, at the eyes that had once stood beneath the hospital awning in the old rain, and his throat tightened. "Tamika?" The woman gave a small nod, her smile not the smile of someone who had come to repay a debt, but the smile of someone who had never forgotten an act of kindness that had saved her life. Tamika did not take Robert to a hotel, nor did she open her wallet and pull out a stack of cash the way rich people often imagined help should look. She took him to the community kitchen behind the old market, where bright white fluorescent lights shone over large pots of soup, crates of freshly washed vegetables, and stainless steel tables scratched from years of serving the poor. The smell of hot cornbread, stew, and black coffee spread through the air, simple but so warm that Robert had to turn his face away to hide the sting in his eyes. Tamika showed him a small room behind the office with a folding bed, a clean blanket, and a towel that still smelled of soap. The next morning, when Robert stepped out in his suit, now dry but still wrinkled, Tamika placed a deep blue apron in front of him. He looked at it as if he were looking at something completely foreign. She told him he could start by washing vegetables, packing meal boxes, then carrying food out to the tables for people who were hungry. Robert accepted it in silence. For the first time in his life, no one called him chairman, no one opened a door for him, no one was afraid of him. But when an old veteran accepted a bowl of soup from his hands and quietly said thank you, Robert suddenly understood that there were values that only appeared when a person had nothing left to show off. 3 days later, a local reporter came to Grace and Grit Kitchen to do a story about the free meals for the homeless after the first storm of the season. At first, Robert simply stood quietly in the back, his baseball cap pulled low, both hands carrying a tray of soup like any other volunteer. When he handed a box of soup to a middle-aged man in line, the man suddenly narrowed his eyes at him and sneered. "Aren't you the billionaire who lost people's money?" The kitchen suddenly went silent for a few seconds. Robert lowered his eyes to the steaming box of soup, not explaining, not arguing, only gently placing it into the man's hands. Tamika stood by the serving counter and saw everything. She saw a man who had once sat at the top of the city, learning how to endure humiliation without losing his dignity. In that very moment, That very moment, the camera caught Robert bending a meal box into the hands of an old man in a wheelchair, then gently pulling the thin blanket up over his shoulders. By evening, the video spread online. The mocking comments came first, calling him a failed billionaire, pretending to be humble. But then, a nurse recognized Tamika's name. Someone else told the story of the Small Business Support Fund from years earlier, and the story began to turn. People no longer saw only a man who had lost money. They saw a man who had once planted kindness when no one was filming. The next morning, Eleanor Caldwell walked into the community kitchen in a cream cashmere coat, her expensive perfume out of place among the smell of hot soup and cornbread. She looked at Robert with eyes wet just enough for others to believe, then said she had been afraid, and that was why she had left. But Tamika stood by the serving counter, watching silently. She knew there were people who did not come back because of love. They came back because the lights had just turned on. Robert almost wanted to believe Eleanor, because there are people who, when they lose everything, still try to hold on to one beautiful memory to prove their life had not been completely wrong. But Tamika did not look at those tears that had been prepared too carefully. She looked at Eleanor's hands, at the diamond ring still on her right hand, at the way she stood in the middle of the community kitchen, like someone who had accidentally stepped into a place beneath her. That evening, after Eleanor left, Isaiah Johnson placed a brown envelope on the kitchen table. The little boy with the heart condition from years ago was now a tall young man, studying finance and helping his mother manage the books for Grace and Grit Kitchen. Isaiah did not find the evidence by luck. He had once interned in a nonprofit auditing department, and it was Eleanor's foundation's public records that made him notice something unusual. Isaiah said that while reviewing old donation records, he discovered that a charity foundation under Eleanor's name had once received money from a shell company, connected to David Mercer, Robert's chief financial officer. Inside the envelope, there was also a photo of Eleanor meeting David at a private restaurant just 3 days before the Caldwell company came under investigation. Robert held the papers as his hand trembled slightly. The numbers on them were colder than any accusation, because they did not cry, did not apologize, did not perform. Tamika did not tell him to take revenge. She only placed a hand on his shoulder and said that the truth sometimes arrives late. But when it does, people must be brave enough to open the door and let it in. The documents in the envelope did not make Robert rich again immediately, but they opened the first door that the truth needed. His attorney turned all the evidence over to investigators, and only a few weeks later, David Mercer was arrested for financial fraud, while Eleanor's charity foundation was frozen so the unusual money transfers could be examined. The news that had once torn Robert Caldwell's name apart now began to change its tone. People said he was not perfect, but he was not the mastermind. People said he had once lost an entire empire, but he still knew how to bend down and hand a hot meal to someone who was hungry. Some former investors came to him, offering to help him rebuild the company. Robert listened, thanked them, then refused to rush back to the old throne. He chose to use the first portion of his released assets to legally invest in Grace and Grit Kitchen, turning Tamika's community kitchen into a job training program for single mothers, veterans, and young people who had nowhere left to begin. At the opening ceremony for the new center, Tamika hung an old photo on the wall of the small food cart outside the hospital 15 years earlier. Robert stood in front of that photo for a long time, his eyes turning red as he realized that an act of kindness he had almost forgotten had become the thread that pulled him out of the darkest night of his life. Eleanor lost the things she had tried to hold on to through calculation. David lost his freedom because of greed, and Tamika, the woman who had never asked for pity, proved that dignity can grow from one fair chance. The lesson is this: money can disappear, reputation can be taken away, but true kindness never dies. It simply lives quietly in the heart of the person who was helped, and one day it returns at the exact moment the person who planted it needs to be saved the most.